You did not lose your faith in a single moment. It happened slowly, the way a wall develops a crack. Not dramatically, not with a sound, just quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you woke up and the whole interior structure was gone, and the terrifying part was not the pain. The terrifying part was the silence. The absence of anything solid to stand on. The feeling that the person you used to be had simply dissolved. Maybe you have been a believer for decades. You served, you tithed, you showed up, and somewhere between all of that faithfulness and this exact moment, something cracked open and went completely dark inside you. Nobody told you this was possible. Nobody in the pew, nobody in the pulpit, nobody in the self-help section of the Christian bookstore prepared you for the specific terror of a soul that has gone structureless. Stop and feel the weight of that. Because there is a phrase sitting in Genesis 1:2 that most of us ran straight past on the way to the talking serpent and the apple. Two Hebrew words waiting 3,000 years for this exact conversation. The phrase is Tohu Wa-Bohu. If you have ever felt completely formless, completely empty, if you have ever stared into your own interior life and found nothing but a darkness with no floor. Moses was not writing backdrop. He was writing a diagnosis, linguistic deconstruction. Most English Bibles render Genesis 1:2 like this. The earth was without form and void. A geological observation. Nothing to do with me on a Tuesday morning when I cannot get out of bed. But that is not what these words mean. Tohu appears in Deuteronomy 32:10 to describe a howling wilderness, a desolate wasteland where nothing can survive. In Isaiah 34:11, it is a place of total ruin, so devoid of structure, it cannot sustain life. No horizon, no up, no down, no center. That is Tohu. And Bohu follows immediately behind it, like an echo designed to deepen the wound. It appears only 3 times in the entire Hebrew Bible, every time alongside Tohu as its intensifier. Biblical scholars describe it as onomatopoeic, a hollow sound, the verbal equivalent of striking a wall you expected to be solid and discovering there is nothing behind it. Tohu Wa-Bohu, not simply without form and void. Desolation, compounding emptiness. Emptiness, amplifying desolation. Renee. Think about a woman named Renee, 61 years old, retired school teacher, has read her Bible through more times than she can count. 3 years ago, after a marriage that slowly disintegrated, a church community that quietly disappeared, and a grief nobody would sit inside with her, she woke up one morning and could not locate herself. Not depressed in the clinical sense. Something underneath that. More foundational. Like the scaffolding holding the depression and the joy and the theology and the memory had simply been removed. She told her daughter it felt like a room where all the furniture had been taken out, formless, empty, tohu wa-bohu. When she went looking for help, she found the 5 steps to emotional healing, the 30-day devotional, the well-meaning friend who quoted Jeremiah 29:11 like a prescription. None of it touched the actual problem. Because you cannot fix a structural collapse with a motivational poster. You cannot speak order into a void with a verse you have already reduced to a bumper sticker. What Renee needed was someone who had been present at the original void. And that is precisely who shows up in the very next line. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, not panicking, not absent, not consulting a plan. Before we go any further, we need to understand what Genesis 1 was written into. The ancient Near East is not a blank canvas. It is a world saturated with creation mythology. Every major civilization surrounding Israel answered the question of origins the same essential way. In Mesopotamia, the reigning cosmological narrative is the Enuma Elish, inscribed on 7 clay tablets, one of the oldest written narratives in human history. 2 primordial beings, Apsu, god of fresh water, and Tiamat, goddess of the chaos ocean, the salt sea, the deep. They produce younger gods. The younger gods grow disruptive. Apsu plots to kill them. They kill him first. Tiamat goes to war. God after god refuses to face her. Finally, a warrior named Marduk volunteers. He defeats Tiamat in single combat, splits her body in 2, and stretches her corpse across the sky to form the heavens and the earth. Stop and feel the weight of that. In the worldview surrounding Israel on every side, creation is an act of violence. Order is the result of domination. Structure emerges from a battle won. And into that precise theological atmosphere, the opening words of Genesis 1 land like a surgical subversion of everything the ancient world thought it knew. There is no battle in Genesis 1, no rival deity, no cosmic army, no dismembered body. There is a God who speaks, and when he speaks, things become. The word, Rachaph. The Hebrew verb for hovering is Rachaph. It appears only twice in the entire Pentateuch, here in Genesis 1:2 and in Deuteronomy 32:11, where it describes an eagle hovering over its nest, spreading its wings to catch its young as they fall. Moses deliberately reaches for the same word in both places. Rachaph carries a sense of intimate, brooding, protective presence, the kind that leans over something vulnerable, that holds itself in readiness above something that cannot yet hold itself up. An eagle does not hover over its nest because the nest is thriving. It hovers because something in the nest needs it. God is not surprised by your Tohu Wa-Bohu. He is not waiting for you to achieve enough structural stability to be worth approaching. He is the God who hovers over the formless, over the empty, over the dark. The Babylonian assumption in Christian clothing. And here is what the Enuma Elish worldview smuggled into our Christianity without our knowing. Fix yourself first. Get stable first. Reach a baseline of functioning, and then God can work with you. That assumption is Babylonian, not biblical. The God of Genesis 1 does not wait for the void to become less voidal before he shows up. He was already near before you had the language to describe what had gone structureless inside you. Day 1 does not begin with filling, it begins with separation. Most people read the 6 days of creation as a sequential inventory, a contractor working through a punch list. But when Hebrew scholars examine the structure of Genesis 1 with any literary seriousness, what they find is a framework structure, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The framework, fulfillment structure. Days 1 through 3 establish domains. On day 1, God separates light from darkness, creating the domain of time. On day 2, he separates the waters above from the waters below, creating the domain of sky and sea. On day 3, he separates the dry land from the gathered waters, creating the domain of earth. 3 days, 3 domains, 3 acts of separation. Then days 4 through 6 fill the domains already established. Day 4 fills the domain of time with the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5 fills the sky and sea with birds and fish. Day 6 fills the earth with land animals, and at the apex of the entire structure, with humanity. Domain, then inhabitant. Structure, then content. Framework, then fulfillment. You cannot populate a space that has no boundaries. You cannot fill a vessel that has no walls. Structure comes before filling, every single time. The flood, inside Renee. Think back to Renee standing in that empty room. Her interior world has flooded. The grief bleeds into the theology. The theology bleeds into the self-accusation. The self-accusation bleeds into the fear. No landmarks, no dry ground, no boundary between what is true and what is terror. The cultural answer to this is to sit inside the ambiguity, hold the complexity, live in the gray. For a person whose interior world is merely complicated, that advice may have some wisdom. But for a person whose interior world has gone tohu wa-bohu, living in the gray is not wisdom. It is drowning described as a spiritual practice. When there is no floor, you do not need nuance. You need dry land. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. The dry land does not manufacture itself. God speaks, the separation happens, the land appears, and it is declared good. Not perfect, not yet fully inhabited, just bounded, separated from the flood. Good. The first move after collapse is not motivation. The first move is a boundary. This is grief. This is anxiety. Not the same thing. This is what I believe. This is what I was told to believe. Not the same thing. This is what happened to me. This is what I am afraid might happen. Two different territories, separated before either one can be inhabited honestly. The framework comes first. The filling comes later, and God is patient enough with the process to give it 6 days instead of 1 afternoon. And there was evening and there was morning. 6 times, 6 days, the exact same phrase, word for word, without variation. That is not punctuation. The Hebrew day begins at sundown. In the ancient Hebrew reckoning of time, a day begins at sundown. The Jewish Sabbath does not begin Saturday morning. It begins Friday at sundown. Every feast, every fast, every sacred calendar marker in the Hebrew Bible is reckoned from evening to morning. A Hebrew day does not begin in the light and descend into darkness. It begins in the darkness and moves toward light. The night is not the end of the day. It is the beginning of the next one. Stop and feel the weight of what that means for a person sitting in the middle of the night of their life. The darkness you are in is not evidence that God has stopped working. The silence that feels like absence is not absence. It is evening. And evening always, always, always has a morning on the other side of it. The theology of incremental days. God did not finish creation in 1 day. He takes 6, not because of limited capacity. This is the God who spoke light into existence. He could have spoken everything simultaneously, in less than a breath. He did not. He built it one evening and morning at a time. That deliberate, unhurried sequence is aimed directly at the person in agony over feeling like they should be further along than they are. 3 months in, and why am I still this broken? A year out from the loss, and why does it still feel like day 1? Rebuilding a world takes more than 1 morning. Each morning preceded by an evening doing something you could not see. Each one arriving not because you performed well enough in the darkness to earn it, but because that is the rhythm God built into the nature of days themselves. Not faster because you tried harder, not slower because you failed. The naming reclaiming agency. There is one more element here, one of the most psychologically precise details in the chapter. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Genesis 1:5. God called the expanse heaven. Genesis 1:8. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. Genesis 1:10. In the ancient Near Eastern world, to name something was to define its nature and declare your authority over it, To name something was to say, I see what you are, and I am not afraid of you. God does not leave the darkness as an unnamed formless terror. He calls it night, a known quantity, a bounded domain under his authority. One of the most paralyzing features of collapse is the inability to name what is happening. You cannot tell whether you are feeling grief or depression or spiritual dryness or 40 years of religious performance pressing down simultaneously in the dark. Unnamed things are ungovernable. An unnamed fear is a monster. A named fear is a problem. Problems have edges. They can be approached, saying not just I am struggling, but I am grieving a version of God I was handed that turned out to be smaller than the actual God. Not just I am burned out, but I have spent 4 decades performing for an audience I mistook for God. That is not a weakness. That is the cognitive equivalent of day 1. That is where agency begins. Not with a plan, with a name. Day 7 has a literary problem. Days 1 through 6 all end the same way, and there was evening and there was morning. Day 7 does not. There is no evening, no morning, no closing cadence. The 7th day in Genesis 2, 1 through 3 opens. God ceases. God blesses the day. God declares it holy, and the sentence remains open. Every other day is bracketed and finished. The 7th day has a beginning and no recorded end. It is, literarily speaking, still open. That is a theological statement about the nature of rest itself. What Shavat actually means. The English word rest has done enormous damage to this passage. When we hear rest, we hear recovery from exhaustion, a depleted body needing to replenish, but the Hebrew verb in Genesis 2:2 is shavat. Shavat means to cease, to discontinue an activity not because you are incapable of continuing, but because the work has reached the state it was always moving toward, and continuing beyond that point would not improve it. It would only disturb it. God does not rest because creation exhausted him. God ceases because creation is complete. Exhaustion rest says, I need to stop because I have nothing left. Shavat says, I am stopping because what I have built is exactly what it was meant to be, and the most important thing I can do now is let it be what it is. One of the most destructive patterns in recovery is the compulsion to keep fixing. Keep adding one more discipline, one more spiritual practice to a structure just barely beginning to stabilize. Genesis 2 says that compulsion is the enemy of integration. You cannot settle into a new architecture while you are still rearranging its furniture. Kadash, the holiest thing. God blesses the 7th day and makes it holy. The Hebrew word is kadash, set apart, consecrated. He does not give this designation to day 1, when light appeared, not to day 6, when humanity was formed in his image. Day 7, the day of ceasing, when the new order is simply allowed to exist without further intervention. The holiest thing you can do after God has begun rebuilding your interior world is to stop trying to accelerate the process. Christological climax. But Genesis 2 is not the last time the 7th day appears in Scripture. The writer of Hebrews reaches back to Psalm 95 and the wilderness generation who could not enter God's rest because of unbelief. Then he makes a claim that reframes the entire creation week. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Hebrews 4:9-10. The open-ended, unclosed 7th day is not a weekly calendar observance. It is a destination, the state the entire creation narrative was always moving toward, where a human being stops performing for an audience they have mistaken for God, stops trying to fix themselves into a state of worthiness, and enters the rest that was completed before they were born. And then, Matthew 11:28 through 30. Jesus, standing in first-century Galilee, surrounded by people ground to powder by the religious performance culture of Second Temple Judaism, says this, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The Greek word for rest in that passage is Anapausis, not hypnos, which is sleep, not hysuchia, which is merely quiet. Anapausis, a ceasing, a stopping, a settling into a completed work, a Sabbath. Jesus is not offering you a vacation from your collapse. He is not offering a temporary reprieve before sending you back into the Tohu Wa-Bohu with a slightly better attitude. He is offering you a new Genesis. He is standing over your formless, empty, dark interior world, the one that decades of religious performance could not fill and self-help culture could not structure, and he is doing what the Spirit of God did in Genesis 1 verse 2. He is hovering, he is already there, he is oriented toward your void, not disturbed by it, not waiting for you to make it more presentable before he begins, and he is speaking, not a checklist, not a performance review, a word. The same kind of word that separated light from darkness over the original deep. The same kind of word that called dry land up out of the flood. The same kind of word that looked at an unfinished, not yet inhabited world and called it good. He is speaking that word over you. And the only thing the seventh day asks, the only thing Anapausis requires, is that you stop trying to speak it yourself. Let him speak. Cease. Let the new architecture settle. Let the evening do what evenings do. Because the morning is already coming. It was never not coming. If this channel has given you depth you stopped believing was available to you, think of one person right now who is in the flood. One person handed a cheerful verse and sent back out into the storm. Share this with them. Not to boost an algorithm, but because that is genuinely how someone in the dark finds a light. And if the historical research, the Hebrew and Greek word studies, and the literary architecture that goes into every one of these documentaries has been worth something to you, it is what keeps this level of work sustainable. Step out of the performance. We will see you in the next one.